It began as a beautiful evening, that the sun was setting across the lake. It's a wonderful way to finish a full-on day together. As they stepped on board the boat and set sail to head off to the new destination, I'm sure they just kind of caught their breath, this sigh after the day they just had. They were anticipating that this calm and enjoyable sail as they moved along. But everything just changed, and changed really suddenly. This is how Mark tells the story in his gospel account. Soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. So from calm to storm, these experienced fishermen were caught by surprise. I mean, surely this isn't happening. These things don't happen to us. And in life, we often get caught by surprise when things don't unfold as we expect they would. I mean, how do we get through this? Now, I'm here today with Becky, and Becky, you've been through some storms in your life. Tell us a bit about some of the waves, I guess, that you've been experiencing lately.
Yeah, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a form of cancer, which came as a big shock to my family because a few years prior, my brother was diagnosed with the exact same form.
Well, so you're diagnosed, and your brother had been diagnosed early. That's huge. Are they related at all?
No, there's no genetic link. No one, and since there's a few years between us, there's no environmental factors.
So this came as big shock for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was expecting to be at school doing NCEA, doing everything a normal teenager would do, yet I was in hospital getting chemotherapy instead.
So you, as an artist, you find that painting is one of those ways that you can process what you're feeling.
Yeah, I'm not the most articulate person, so expressing myself through my art, through my painting, is a way to get my message across, my story, to talk about my story.
Well, I think we're very privileged today to have you paint for us, and look forward to seeing what it is that you're going to lead us through, and I guess showing us how you're processing through the storm that you've been experiencing. Thank you. Well, as we've seen, the disciples are in the midst of this violent storm on the Sea of Galilee. And Mark contrasts these two responses to the storm. On the one hand, we have the disciples who are absolutely terrified. Remember, some of the men here are experienced fishermen, so if they think they're going to drown, this is a doozy of a storm. On the other hand, as Mark continues here, he looks at Jesus' response. He says, Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" So the disciples are terrified. At the opposite extreme is Jesus, and he's asleep, as calm can be. I mean, this could be infuriating. This could come across as dismissive. And then we read that Jesus gets up and he asks them a question. He asked these frightened disciples this question. It's a question that's got under my skin this week. Why are you afraid? Well, what are you talking about, Jesus? We're in a storm. But why are you afraid? Well, Jesus, we might die. Why are you afraid? Well, we don't know what's going to happen. See, I think Jesus is asking you and me the same question as we navigate through this storm of COVID-19 and step into this unknown world. Many of us right now are facing wave after wave of uncertainty. And we can come up with a long list, line after line, of all these things, of all these reasons why we're overwhelmed with fear. Some of you are worried about your job. Some of you are worried about livelihood and health of a parent or grandparent. You're worried about your kids. If I'm honest, what keeps me awake at night is worried about your worry, that some of you are losing your jobs, and some of you are really anxious at this moment. It keeps me awake as well. But in the midst of all of this unknown, if we just tune our ears, we will be able to hear this gentle whisper of Jesus. Why are you afraid? Well, Jesus, I don't know where you've been, but there's this pandemic happening all around the world. But why are you afraid? Well, people are losing their jobs, Jesus. The economy's tanking. But why are you afraid? See, initially you might think of Jesus' question as dismissive, like he doesn't understand what we're going through. But when you see what Jesus sees and you know what Jesus knows, you're able to fearlessly navigate through the storm into the unknown world. This is exactly why Mark shares his gospel account of Jesus' life with us. Now, this story of the storm is not the only crisis that Mark writes about. In fact, Mark goes out of his way to show us 4 different crises that happen in just a day and a half in the life of Jesus. Each crisis is different from the other, and yet there's something they all have in common with each other, and that's fear. Every one of these stories is afraid. And it's like Mark is throwing us the most fear-inducing, worst-case scenarios of life in the unknown. And he wants us to sit back with this question. Why are you afraid? So let me highlight these 4 crises. That they all start with D, because this is the ultimate D-Day in the life of Jesus. Now, the first one we've seen already. Crisis number 1, natural disaster. The storm. But then we have crisis 2, unknown demons. Mark continues the story. He says, so they arrived at the other side of the lake. This is just after the storm. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from a cemetery to meet him. Day and night he wandered around the burial caves and in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. So there are these unseen forces going on in this man's life, and they're hard to explain. That they're causing self-harm, they're destroying his life, they're removing him from normal society, from the relationships with family and friends. And some of you can identify with this guy. You might identify with some power, whatever it is that's raging underneath, causing all sorts of harm to yourself and to others. It's a scary place to be when a dangerous power is calling the shots. But it's like this question continues to confront us. But why are you afraid? Well, there are these unseen, unknown forces, Jesus, causing all this umpteen damage. But why are you afraid? In a moment, we'll see why Jesus isn't afraid. But let's come to crisis number 3 that Jesus encountered in this day and a half. And that's disease. Mark continues to write. A woman in the crowd has suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she hadn't gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. So this woman had a hemorrhage that's lasted for 12 long years. And in desperation, she has spent everything she's had on medical treatments. Instead of getting any better health, we're told she's gotten worse. On top of all this, she lives in a culture where people saw her illness as this contagious disease. So everybody keeps their social distancing laws. They do everything to keep their distance from her. Now, if you or someone you love have a health condition, you'll understand the fear that this woman was facing, the fear of the unknown. And once again, it's like Mark dangles this question in front of those facing health challenges. Why are you afraid? Well, I've tried everything and nothing seems to work. Or I see my mum's health and it's getting worse and worse by the day, and we don't know what's going to happen. But why are you afraid? Well, Jesus, there's no options. I feel powerless. But why are you afraid? Now, again, in a moment, we'll see why Jesus isn't afraid. But there's one other crisis that Jesus encountered in this day and a half. Crisis number 4 is death. Mark continues. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. If there's one area that pulls the emotional cords of each of us, it's when a child is dying. I mean, death for anyone at any time is horrid, but when a child is facing it, it's just wrong. And you can hear the desperate words of a desperate dad here. My little daughter is dying. Just please come and lay your hands on her, heal her, so that she can live. So Jesus starts to head off to Jairus' house. But before they get to his home, we read the messengers arrived with this message for Jairus saying the news that no dad ever wants to hear. Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now. Your daughter is dead. 4 words snuff out any glimmer of hope. So in this day and a half, Jesus faces these 4 significant crises: disaster, demons, disease, and death. I think these 4 words cover a vast spectrum of the predicaments that we face, don't they? And all this happens in just like a day and a half. You can think of this as the ultimate D-Day. And do you notice here how varied the characters are in these 4 stories? First, you have the disciples, these strong men who don't like to let their guard down, and yet suddenly they're afraid. It's this doozy of a storm and fishermen are frightened for their lives. And then there's this man in isolation. Strange and dangerous things are happening in his life. The only name we have for him refers to the legion of demons. In other words, his identity is so tied up to his condition. A contrast to him is Jairus, a man of high standing in the community, a synagogue leader. He would have been on the wealthy end of the spectrum, and yet he too now was afraid because his little girl was dying. And then the contrast between Jairus and this unnamed woman with this hemorrhage couldn't be stronger. She wasn't even allowed in the synagogue where Jairus was a leader of the synagogue. She'd given every penny she had to try to come up with some health treatment. He's a wealthy guy. Jairus has a name. None of the other characters do. But each of these characters have something in common. It's fear. See, while the predicaments they face are so different from each other, they all have the same sense of powerlessness. They're afraid of the unknown. And isn't that what we're feeling right now? Fear. We're connecting, aren't we, from different areas, different backgrounds, different ethnicities and ages and stages. But if there's something that we all know right now, it's fear. We're afraid of the unknown. We're afraid of what's ahead. It's what keeps us awake in the small hours of the night, wondering what's going to happen in the future. I mean, what's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to my staff? What if somebody gets sick? What impact will all of this have on my children? But when you know what Jesus knows and you see what Jesus sees, you're able to fearlessly navigate through the storm into this unknown world. So let's go back to these crises and see the difference the presence of Jesus brings. So what happens to disaster in the storm? Well, remember, Jesus' disciples are terrified and Jesus is asleep. We read when Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. The disciples were absolutely terrified. I mean, who is this man? They asked each other. Even the wind and waves obey him. Now, the irony here, of course, is the disciples had been afraid of the storm. Now they're even more afraid because they realize They're in the presence of someone who has power to calm a raging storm. Now that's the first crisis. Well, what difference did the presence of Jesus make to the demons? Well, Jesus looks at this man with these demons and says, "Come out of the man, you evil spirit." And it's all just pretty simple. There's no magic formula, no big fanfare. But listen to the result. They saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there fully clothed and perfectly sane, and they were all afraid. See, just like that, Jesus has released him from these unseen powers. This man is now healthy and sane. The irony, again, is that the crowd is now afraid because they have a glimpse of the power of Jesus. They realize they're in the presence of someone who has immense power. But what difference did Jesus make to the third crisis of the debilitating disease? Remember, this woman is desperate for healing. She's tried everything these past 12 years. We read she had heard about Jesus. So she came up behind him through the crowd and she touched his robe, and immediately the bleeding stopped. And she could feel in her body that she had been healed of this terrible condition. Now this time Jesus doesn't even say anything. Just his presence, just a touch, and there's immediate relief. We read that Jesus asks her who touched him to be healed. The frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and she fell to her knees in front of him. You see, she realizes that she's in the presence of somebody with power. And initially that's frightening to her. So Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." The power of Jesus utterly transformed her situation. And then, of course, there's that final predicament, death. So Jesus comes to the home of Jairus, where his young daughter now lies dead. We read, holding her hand, Jesus said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Just two simple words. It's not the words that matter, it's the person who's speaking these words. We read the girl who was 12 years old immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. So let's think about what's happening here. That there are 4 different crises. Let's recap what we've seen. The 4 crises are all so different from each other. The people in the story are so different from each other. And yet they all have the same common element, fear of the unknown. And now we see that each of these situations is utterly transformed by the power of Jesus and the presence of Jesus. So how does all of this help us as we navigate this COVID-19 storm? Well, in the same way, we're all facing a raft of diverse challenges. We're a range of different people connecting in today. We all have the same common element, fear. And like them, each of us, whatever our situation is, can see it utterly transformed by the power and presence of Jesus. The best definition I've heard of anxiety is imagining the future without Jesus in it. See, when you imagine the unknown without the presence and the power of Jesus, you do have reason to be anxious. As we navigate through this current storm, I know it's hard to see. And many of you are feeling that wave after wave is tossing everything it has at you. And it can be terrifying. And you don't know what's going to happen. And if you can't see or imagine Jesus with you in all of the storm that's happening, if you can't imagine Jesus with you in the unknown, you will be anxious. But the way we navigate into the unknown is by being sure of what we do know. And what is known is that Jesus is right here in the storm. And when you know the presence and the power of Jesus, you have no reason to be afraid. So let's come back to that whisper of Jesus. Why are you afraid? Well, Jesus, I might lose my job. I've got kids to feed. I've got bills to pay. But doesn't my word remind you that I shall supply all your needs? But Jesus, I don't know what's going to happen. It's a whole new world out there. But friend, you don't have to step into this world alone, Jesus says. I will go with you. Just grab my hand. We're in this together. And besides, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, Jesus, people are dying. But Jesus replies to us, you don't need to be afraid of death. I've been through death already. I've been there for you. And the sting of death is now gone, so that even death itself cannot separate you from my love. You see, I don't know what challenges are ahead of you. My guess is that some of you will face some crashing waves ahead. But the way you navigate into the unknown is by being sure of what is known. And what is known is that Jesus is right here in the storm with us. And I want you to be sure of this, that you have nothing to fear. See, you and I can navigate through the storm by grabbing hold of the hand of Jesus. He is present and he is powerful. And if you're afraid of what lies ahead, I'd like to take this moment to pray. So Jesus, many linking in today are trying to navigate their way through the unknown. It's a scary time for many of them. It's hard to see what lies ahead as wave after wave are tossing everything at them. Help them see that they are not alone. Help them grasp the power you have over disaster and demons and disease, even death itself. May they hear your gentle whisper. Why are you afraid? May they realize it's this invitation to a life with you. May they realize they have no reason to fear, for you are with each of us in this storm. And so, Jesus, would you help us to be a non-anxious presence to our neighbors and colleagues? Help us to have a fearless abandon as we point people to you, the Prince of Peace, and as we help and serve in any and every way that we can. So, Jesus, I pray for people linking in today who may be exploring what faith looks like, and they're unsure. Would you help them as well to take a step towards you today and experience what it is to be a friend of God? Thank you, Jesus. Amen.